Alright, I've got our box of parts here, and in the last video when I was tearing it down, I actually mentioned about how I thought I actually got one of the O-rings, and I did not get that O-ring. So I had to wait about 4 days to get the O-ring in, so now I have all the parts, and unfortunately there was no O-ring that I could find for the oil level sensor. I could find the sensor, but I could not find the O-ring for it. So I don't know if it comes with the sensor, but the sensor was like $71, so I'm not replacing that. But we got all our parts, so let's go ahead and start reassembling this bike. I'm dying to get it back together. It's been about a week since we took it apart, and yeah, let's go. So I printed off the parts diagrams, that way I could figure out where all these O-rings go because there's so many of them. I think there's 9 in total. So I went through and matched up all the part numbers with their numbers, and I wrote down on the parts themselves which number they are on the diagram. So that should make it a lot easier when we are reassembling. And to start off this reassembly process, we are going to start off by replacing this gasket right here, which is actually going to be in a groove inside the case, and that's the part of the inlet that will feed through the case, and that's going to be the seal for it. So we're going to start off by replacing that because that is a gasket that could be easily missed and forgotten about. So we're going to start there so we don't forget about it, and then we are going to put the oil pump, water pump in. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so this is our O-ring part number. This is going to be the water pump case inlet, and I wrote it down, number 26 on the part diagram. And they say to use a lithium soap grease to apply to the O-ring for installing it, and I could not find anything of the sort. So depending on where the O-rings are going is going to determine what kind of lubricant I'm going to put on the O-ring. So let's go ahead and get this installed. And it is going to go into this hole right here in the side of the case. You can barely see, but there is an O-ring inside there, so we're going to get to that one first. Now, to get most of these O-rings out, I'm going to be using a mini screwdriver, flathead, little pocket screwdriver, and I'm also going to be using a curved hook pick. So this O-ring, if you can see my fingers through there right here, that's where we're going. So I should be able to just get a pick in there and pick her right on out. There we go. So this is what we were replacing here. It still feels really good, really malleable. And so we honestly probably could have gotten away with not replacing this, but you're in here, you better just replace everything just to make sure, because you don't want anything happening in the long run afterwards. So, all right, let's put the new one on. And here it is. And you can compare. They are the same. Always compare your O-rings. I don't want to put the wrong ones in the wrong locations. To be honest, I think I'm just going to use engine oil on it because that one already has engine oil on it, so we'll do that. Just use some off of here. And then we'll just tuck that O-ring right back into the case, right inside the groove. Probably have to use your hand from the other side to hold it in while you can kind of tuck it in there. Alright, now once that's in, we are okay to put the oil pump, water pump in. Okay, now before I put the oil pump in, I'm going to put a little bit of oil into the inlet port of the oil pump, and I'm going to rotate it through just to get some oil inside the oil pump. Alright, so upon reassembly, for all the bolts that I'm going to be using Loctite for, I'm going to be using the blue Loctite thread locker, and this is medium strength, which will allow you to still be able to remove everything with hand tools, just in case if we have to remove any of this stuff later on down the road. So that's what we'll be using to reassemble. I'm also going to be using this Mobil 1 4T racing oil. This is what I use in all my bikes, but I'm going to use this right now to put a little bit of oil into our new oil pump. That way we can prime it up a little bit. That way it's not dry when we go to initially start this. So, but before we do initially start it, I am also going to try and prime it another way. But for now, let's put a little bit of oil into this. I'm also going to apply a little bit of oil to these bearings in here because I don't know if you can see or not, but there is just an open bearing here, and I believe that's how they get lubed up. Alright, so I got a little bit of oil into these bearings in here. Should put some on these teeth too. And then also into the pump, so you can hear that. I'm also going to put a little bit of oil around this, because that's where that's going to go through that O-ring that we just installed. Alright, so I think we are good to go to reinstall this now. Let's first try and get the chain on here. It does appear to be a little bit more difficult than it looks. Okay. Chain is on. That's good. Now let's try and fit it into this hole. Alright, there we go. So before we put these bolts in here, I think I want to go up top and put that sleeve in and get our gear and our chain all set up before I go ahead and torque these down. So I'm going to go ahead and move us up top so we can see that. Okay, so now I have our sleeve, and this side of the sleeve is where that gear was riding, as you can see by the wear on it. So I want to put oil on the outside of this and on the inside of this, and then slide it onto our shaft here and underneath our gear. And it is still on the water pump down below, so that is perfect. So let's go back down there and let's put our bolts into the water pump so we can index it. Then we can come back up and put our chain guide back on up here. And then we'll be done with this, and then we can finish reassembling the underneath. So now that we have our pump in here, we need to get our dowel pin in. That way it'll index our pump so it's straight. That way our chain does not come off at high RPMs. So we need to get this in there, that way we can have everything aligned. So, and that's going to go in back here. This needs to come out a little bit. Okay, I think we are in there. Not sure how far it's supposed to go in, but it definitely went in a little bit. So I think that's all the way in there. So let's go ahead and get our bolts in and torque them down. Alright, now I'm going to apply Loctite to both of the bolts, and then I'm going to torque them down to spec. I applied Loctite to the first bolt, and I'm going to get that started. And it does go in nice and easy, so it must be lined up pretty decent. Alright, and then we'll do the same thing with the other bolt. And again, Loctite this bolt, and this will go in where the dowel pin was. And it looks like the dowel pin is sliding out, so that must be right, because I know when we took this apart, it just slid out as well, so. Oh yeah, and it just threads in nice and easy, so again, I think we're in the right spot. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and torque those down to the torque spec, which is 12 Newton meters, and that's roughly about 8.7 foot-pounds according to the manual. So Let me get my torque wrench and we'll torque those down. All right, like I said, these are torqued to 12 Newton meters, and I have my torque wrench set to 12 Newton meters. I don't know if that is seen in the camera or not, but here we go. Now that those are torqued, let's go ahead and put the chain guide on. So let's go around to the other side of the motor. All right, so the chain guide is labeled up. So we're gonna place this in this position, and it also has a locking tang on it, which will go into that hole. I have already applied Loctite to the first bolt, and we'll put that in here. Alright, with Loctite on this one, we'll insert it as well. Alright, now let's go ahead and torque those bolts down to 10 Newton meters. But first, let's make sure this chain and the oil pump and everything rotates freely. Oh yeah, it moves nice. All right, now let's torque those down. All right, now that those are torqued, again, let's check, make sure it moves freely. And it does. Now that we have everything back together up here and everything moves freely, let's go ahead and move on to our water pump outlet pipe. All right, so according to the parts diagram, what we're going to be replacing next are these two O-rings. One is going to go back on this portion of the pipe, and one is going to go on this front portion of the pipe. And these are our two O-rings we're going to be using. And like I said, I labeled them prior to. So they're not the same size. They may look pretty close in this image, but this one is larger than this one. So, all right, now let's go ahead and replace these O-rings and reinstall that outlet pipe. All right, here is our outlet pipe. We're gonna be replacing this O-ring and this O-ring. And for this O-ring, because this one actually slides into the water pump, I'm gonna use this Mobil 1 synthetic grease. This is the closest thing I could find to lithium soap grease. So I'm gonna use just a very small amount of this, just to lightly coat it. That way it just slides in easier when we reassemble. But for this other O-ring right here, which is gonna be an O-ring that goes into the case, I'm gonna use engine oil to lubricate this one, because that is what would be around this O-ring. So we're gonna use the synthetic grease for this one, and then the engine oil for this one. So let's go ahead and pop those off. There's our first one for the coolant. And there is our case one. They both feel still pretty good. Probably could have reused them, but better safe than sorry. I always replace gaskets when I'm opening stuff up because, again, you don't want any problems down the road. All right, so I'm putting a little coat of oil on this. All right, so I got a thin coat of oil on this, and now we're gonna slide it on. All right, now let's put our coolant O-ring on. All right, so this will be this one. And I'm gonna put a very small amount of this grease on here. All right, so it has a thin layer of grease on it. Let's go ahead and install it onto our pipe. Now that our new O-rings are on, this piece is ready to be installed back onto our bike. All right, so first we're gonna run this through the hole in the case, and we're gonna get this part to line up with our water pump, and then we're gonna try and get our hoses somewhat situated, and then we're gonna finalize by pushing it all the way in and then putting our bolt in and locking it down. So let's do that. Alright, so let's get our hose on here. Be careful not to damage any of the O-rings. Alright, got it started. Actually, real quick, before I put this smaller pipe on, I am going to replace that clamp on there, so I'm going to pull that off and get my new clamp situated. It's always a good idea to replace these spring clamps because once you break tension on them, they're never as strong as they were, so I always just replace them just to make sure. But if I don't actually break them free or loosen them, then I just leave them as they are. Alright, now that we have our new clamp on, we're going to pop this hose onto the cooler, and then we should be ready to bolt in this pipe. Get that started. Yeah, alright. So here's our new O-rings, and we're just going to work this pipe into the water pump and into the case. Okay. A little bit of a tight fit, but it is on and it feels like it's in there pretty good. So now we need to put our bolt in right here, which is also going to be Loctited and torqued to 10 Newton meters. So let's go ahead and do that next. Alright, now our bolt has Loctite on it. Let's go ahead and thread it in and torque it to spec. And we'll just get this snug real quick, and then we'll torque it down. Alright, let's grab the torque wrench and torque this down. Our torque wrench is already set to 10 Newton meters, and here we go. Alright, now that the outlet pipe is torqued down, let's go ahead and move on to our inlet pipe. Now the next O-ring we're going to be replacing is number 39. We've already replaced number 26 because that was the one that went into the case that we replaced before we put the pump in. So again, number 39 we're going to be replacing, and here's the part number for it, and that's what it looks like. So we're going to be replacing that and then reinstalling that pipe, putting in the bolt and torquing it to spec. So let's go ahead and do that. So now we're going to be replacing the O-ring on the end of this pipe. Let's go ahead and get this old one off and then clean up the tube a little bit, and then we will put the new O-ring on. And again, that O-ring will have a little bit of that synthetic grease on it, just a thin coat, just to help inserting it into this pipe. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, now let's pull this O-ring off here. Should just slide right off. Alright, so there is our O-ring. It's pretty dirty. Let's go ahead and clean off that pipe, and then that way it's nice and clean for reassembly. Alright, make sure the inlet for the water pump is nice and clean. That way when we insert this, there's no debris in there. And ours looks pretty good, so let's go ahead and put our new O-ring on and get this pipe installed. Alright, our new O-ring has a thin layer of grease on it. Let's go ahead and put it onto our tube and insert it into the inlet port on our water pump. Alright, so let's go ahead and get our bolt in there. That way it will stay locked into position. Alright, now the bolt that goes here on the water pump side is the one that does not have the washer on it. The one with the washer on it will go towards the front side of this pipe. So I'm going to put some thread locker on this, and then we'll get it inserted and torque it down. that one's in, let's go ahead and put thread locker on the other bolt and get that one started, and then we can torque both of them at the same time. Alright, and also while we're down here, I'm just going to torque this one to 10 Newton meters as well. So let's get the torque wrench and torque these down. Alright, the torque wrench is set to 10 Newton meters. And we move to this one right here. Alright, now that those two are torqued, let's go ahead and torque this bolt. Alright, now that all three of these are torqued, we can go back underneath and we can complete underneath there so we can put the pan back on and get this thing going. Alright, now that we're back underneath here, we're going to pop out this oil pressure relief valve and replace the O-ring on that. And if you haven't noticed, you need to be careful on yours if you're doing this yourself, but there is an O-ring still stuck inside of here. And if you were to leave that in here and not notice that and put another O-ring on top of that, there's a good chance that you would have oil pressure problems because this is for the oil delivery pipe. So make sure you check and make sure all the old O-rings have been removed when you go to reassemble. So first, let's pop this out. It should just pop right out. And we're going to put a new O-ring on there, and then it should just pop right back in. So, and we're just going to use the trusty pick. And the O-ring we have to replace it, let me get that out. If you compare it to the one we have, it is the same. And again, this one probably would have been fine, but we're in here, we're going to replace it. I'm going to put a little bit of oil on it. This oil is pretty fresh, so I'm not too worried about using it. And new one is on. Alright, now with our new O-ring on and it lubed, let's go ahead and put it back where it went. And just as easy as that, the pressure relief valve is back in. Alright, now that I saw this O-ring, let's go ahead and pull that out of here. That's going to go to our oil delivery pipe, and that one is still pretty good too. They're kind of hard, but they're not like crazy, so pull that one out, and let's go get the oil delivery pipe, which is that small rod that was bolted to here, I believe, and goes up in. And they want you to blow through it and make sure it's clear of any clogs. So I'm going to get some compressed air real quick and get the tube, and we'll go ahead and blow some air through it. And if it blows clean, then we'll go ahead and reinstall it. Alright, now here is our oil delivery tube. We're also going to Loctite this bolt going in. So they want us to blow through this and make sure there's no clogs. I'm pretty sure there aren't any, but we're going to go ahead and check it anyways. So I've got a can of computer spray duster. We'll just blow her through. It's definitely blowing through onto my finger, so we're good. Alright, I'm going to put some Loctite on our bolt to get it ready. Alright, so this tube does go into a hole in the case somewhere up in here. It's kind of hard to see where it goes. It's pretty tucked up in there, so there's not going to be any way for me to really show you, but when you pull it apart, make sure you keep track of where it goes. But it is pretty far up in there, right where my finger's at, up and above where this pipe's at, so you can't really see it. I'm going to actually move the flashlight so I can see it better, but I'm going to put a little bit of lube on this, some oil, just because it is going to go into a hole up there, so I want it to slide in easy. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil on that and then slide her in, and then we'll put the bolt in and tighten it down to torque spec, which is 10 Newton meters. So it does go quite a ways up into that hole. Let's get our bolts in there now. Alright, now it's snug. Let's go ahead and get the torque wrench and torque that to 10 Newton meters. Alright, the torque wrench is already set to 10 Newton meters from before, so let's torque this down. Now that we have our oil delivery pipe torqued to spec, let's go ahead and put on our oil transfer tube. Alright, now this oil transfer pipe is going to require 2 O-rings, and they are both the exact same. Here's the part number, and this is what it looks like. So let's go ahead and replace these O-rings, reinstall that pipe and its bolts, and then torque them down to spec. Alright, here's our transfer tube, and here's one O-ring, and remember our other one was stuck, so don't forget again to remove any O-rings that might get stuck in these holes, because there was one stuck in here too, so be aware of that. But let's go ahead and replace these. And with our new O-rings, we're going to want to lube them with engine oil. Put the first one on here. So now that we have our new O-rings on, let's put this pipe into place, and then we will put our bolts in with Loctite and torque them to spec. And it should just go right here. There we go. Now that I've applied Loctite, we're going to put these bolts in and torque them down. Alright, again, Loctite on this bolt, and let's thread it in. Alright, let's torque these to spec, and then we'll move on. Alright, I got my torque wrench set to 10 Newton meters. Let's torque those down. Alright, now that that is torqued down, all we have left is our weep hole, water pump tube, and also our strainer. So let's go ahead and put those two things in, and then we'll be done under here. Then we can put our oil pan cover back on. Alright, the O-ring we need to replace for our strainer is number 3 on this diagram, and that is part number, and it looks like this. So let's go ahead and replace this O-ring. We'll put our 3 bolts in with Loctite and then torque those to spec. Alright, so before we install our strainer, I do see a little bit of debris inside of our mesh here, so I do want to spray it out with some brake clean and then blow some air through it and dry everything off. So I don't see any damage. I do see it's kind of like pushed in a little bit, I guess, but I guess I don't really consider that damage. It looks intact from what I can see, so I'm going to spray some brake clean on the inside of the tube, because I do see a little bit of some gunk inside there too. So we'll spray everything clean, then use some spray duster and just blow everything dry, and then we will reinstall this. Alright guys, it is super hot out. The camera died again because it overheated, so actually you didn't get to see me spray brake clean through this and clean everything off. But I cleaned out the inside with brake clean, sprayed it with the red straw they give you. I just tucked it down in here and just sprayed a ton out of it, and got the inside really looking clean now, as you can see. And I did see some debris in the pan that I don't think was in there before, and unfortunately I didn't record it, so I can't see if that's what came out of it or not. But needless to say, it's looking a lot better now. So let's go ahead and put our new O-ring on and get this put back onto the bike. Alright, I've got our strainer and I've got our new O-ring. I'm going to put some oil on this, put it on here, put it in place, and I'm going to use just a regular bolt for now to hold it in place while I Loctite the other two. Then I'll pull this out and put Loctite on this and then run it in, and then I will torque all 3 at the same time. With our new O-ring in place, we'll put our strainer on. Now let's apply Loctite to our bolts and we'll thread them in. Now that we've got our 3 bolts in, let's go ahead and torque those to spec, which will be 10 Newton meters. Again, the torque wrench is already set from prior. Now that those are torqued to spec, let's go ahead and put in our water pump weep hole tube. Alright, tearing this apart, I said that I had thought that I got both O-rings. Well, I didn't, and I had to wait 4 days for it to get in. So be sure you order both of these O-rings when you put yours together. So we're going to replace the number 28 on here. They're both the same O-ring, and they just seal off the tube for the weep hole on the water pump. And this is the part number, and this is what it looks like. So let's go ahead and replace those O-rings, put that tube in, and then we can go ahead and put on our oil pan. Alright, now here is our water pump weep hole tube, and if you remember, this O-ring was stuck in our old water pump, so all I have to do is pull this one off, like so. I'll put engine oil on the new O-rings, and then it will go into this hole right here. It'll just snap in just like our oil pressure relief valve, and then when we put our oil pan on, it'll go into a little port on the bottom of the oil pan. Here's the two new O-rings. I'll apply oil to these and put them onto our pipe. Alright. Now, like I said, this tube should just plop right into here. And there we go. Now that we are done with everything underneath here, let's get our oil pan on. Alright, I have all of my bolts laid out here that we have left remaining, and I put all of the oil pan bolts in the specific order that they came off. So the service manual says that one of these bolts is supposed to have Loctite on it. By looking at each and every one, I cannot say for certain which one had Loctite on it. My guess would be this one because it's discolored compared to all the rest, but nothing really stands out to me that shows that they had Loctite on them. So I'm going to put a little bit of Loctite on each one of these just to be safe. So let's go ahead and get our oil pan. We'll put our dowel pins in it. We'll put our new gasket on, and we'll go ahead and tuck it up underneath the motor, and we can put our bolts in. So let's go ahead and get our oil pan on. So not only did I have camera difficulties, I also had audio difficulties for the next couple of steps. So I'm going to do my best to try and repeat what I thought I said because I recorded this a while ago, but here we go. Typically when I'm applying gaskets to an oil pan, I will use a weather strip adhesive to hold the gasket in place. Thankfully on our oil pan here we have 2 dowel pins which will hold our gasket in place when we go to install the pan. Once we get our mating surface all clean, we can stick our dowel pins in, and then we can apply our gasket. Now that we have our gasket on, we can go ahead and reinstall this oil pan onto the bike. Now that we're back underneath here, much like our oil pan, we need to clean off our mating surface of any oil or debris. So what we're going to do is take a clean rag and some brake clean, spray our rag with some brake clean, and then wipe down our mating surface for our gasket. Once we have our mating surface clean, we want to go ahead and take some oil and lube up the O-ring for our water pump weep hole because that is going to be going into a hole on our oil pan. So when we go to put our oil pan on, I found it easiest to line up the water pump weep hole first with the hole in the bottom of the pan where my thumb is at. Once you kind of have that started into the hole, then you can go ahead and try and line up the dowel pins into their holes on the bottom of the case. And it does take a little bit of finesse and some wiggling, but it should just pop into place once you have it all lined up, and it will hold itself there on its own, which is kind of convenient. That way you can go ahead and get your pan bolts in. So now that we have the oil pan on, let's go ahead and get the remainder of our bolts in. Now before we put our oil pan bolts in, I am going to be Loctiting every bolt. The service manual only says that one of them need to be Loctited, like I said, but just to be safe, I'm going to Loctite all of them. So first I'm going to put all these bolts in kind of in a crisscross pattern for the most part and just get them hand tight. Once they're all hand tight, then we'll go back through and torque them all down to spec. The service manual states that you should put these bolts in and torque them down in stages, but they do not specify the stages that you should take. Typically they'll give you a torque spec for stage 1, and then for stage 2 will be the final torque spec. Either it's a torque spec or a torque angle, and usually the torque angle are on torque to yield bolts, but these bolts are not torque to yield, so we can reuse them. Since they don't give us any direction in what these stages should be, I'm just going to do about half the torque of the final torque for our first stage, just to kind of get everything seated nicely, then go back through and torque everything to spec in a crisscross pattern. All right, now that we have most of our bolts in, I'm saving our oil level sensor bolt with our bracket for last. That way we can reroute our sensor, so we'll go ahead and route that through our hole here. And the service manual does not give you an O-ring to replace for this. So what they really want you to do is actually just lube the O-ring with engine oil, and if it's leaking, they want you to replace the sensor. Thankfully, ours was not leaking, so I'm going to clean off our seal, and then I'm going to apply fresh oil to our O-ring. Once the fresh oil is applied, I'm going to go ahead and insert it into the bottom of our oil pan, and you will have to wiggle the sensor a little bit to get the holes to line up. That way you can thread your bolts in. Now, these bolts do not say that there is Loctite required for them, but I'm going to go ahead and put a tiny amount of Loctite on each of these bolts just for good measure. Insert your bolts and thread them in. Alright guys, I've been having some camera difficulties and microphone difficulties. I hope this is working now. I'm not sure where the last video left off, so now that we have all of our bolts in here, let's go ahead and torque this oil pan down to spec. These bolts for the oil pan are going to be torqued to 12 Newton meters, and we're going to do them in a crisscross pattern as best as we can. And also a tip for when you're doing oil pan bolts or anything that has multiple bolts and you have to do it in a crisscross pattern, I like to use a Sharpie or a paint pen and mark each bolt after I'm done. That way I keep track of which ones I have already torqued down. Now for the second stage, we're going to go ahead and torque these all down to 12 Newton meters. And on this, I'm going to mark each one that I do. Alright, that should be all of the bolts. Let's go ahead and double check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And that's what my torque wrench said, is that we did 14 bolts. And we have 14 bolts, so that was good. I'm going to go around and just start from here and just double check them all the way around. Now that we have all of our oil pan bolts torqued to spec, hopefully it recorded that. Now let's go ahead and torque our last two bolts down, which are our oil level sensor bolts, and those are torqued to 10 Newton meters. So let's go ahead and torque those down quick. Now that we have all of our bolts under here torqued to spec, let's go ahead and get our center stand on. A quick little friendly reminder, if you are doing engine work over multiple days where you have the engine apart and it's open, always cover up the open spots just when you're not working on it, because you don't want any debris or bugs or anything flying into there and getting into the motor that could cause damage. So always cover up your open engine components, and also if you have the exhaust off, it is a good idea just to cover up the exhaust ports, because some of those cylinders are going to have valves open leading into the pistons, and you don't want to get moisture in there and rust and stuff like that. So it's always a good idea to cover up open engine parts. Yeah, just protect yourself from anything that could go awry. So friendly reminder. All right, now before we get our center stand up into position, I do want to get our O2 sensor back rerouted through this hole. That way we have it ready for putting our exhaust on. So let's go ahead and do that quick. And it was just routed like right through here, just how our oil level sensor was. All right, so I'm gonna use a punch to help hold this center stand up because I'm gonna have to be able to go to both sides and get it held kind of into place so I can at least start the bolts. So I'm gonna use this on one side just to hold it while I get the other side started. Then I'll come back over, pull this out, and then thread in the bolts. So that should just make it easier going back together. You could also use a screwdriver or anything like that just to make it easier, because this can be kind of hard if it's just a one-person job. So let's go ahead and do that. And let's see if we can get this somewhat started without the spring falling off. Alright, so that's going to hold it into place over here while we go to the other side, and hopefully we can get the bolts started over there. Because this side has the spring on it, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, so we'll save this side for last. Alright, before we get this lined up, it is also a good idea to have a screwdriver if you don't have a punch like that. Having multiple of these, that way you can kind of hold them in, and also to, since there's two holes here, you can use one side to pry it up and kind of line everything up. So that's what I'm going to use on this side to get everything lined up. So let's get these two bolts threaded in. This side is going to be much easier again because it doesn't have a spring on here giving us tension. So perfect. Let's start our nuts on the back side. We can put our hose back in here. Now, before we torque these down, we're going to go to the other side and get the other bolts threaded in. Then once we have all the bolts in, then we'll go back through and tighten all four of them down. All right, let's get our two bolts ready, and let's see if we can't get these to line up. I don't know if having it down is going to make it easier or not to get these lined up, because actually this one looks pretty lined up right now. Forgot, I got to pull this bolt out that we can get that one in. Whoops. Alright, that one is in. I'm going to move this back down because it feels like I can line them up better. Let's get it locked this time, that way it doesn't... Yeah, perfect. So that relieves the tension off of the spring, or I don't know what it does, but actually it feels like there's tension on it now. And I don't know, it made it really easy to line up, so we'll just get that in there. Perfect, and let's get our two nuts on the back side. Then we can go ahead and torque all four of these down. It's kind of a tight fit up in here. Kickstand back. There really should be some rubber on this thing because it literally hits on the arm for the rear suspension. You can see that there. It literally hits on this arm. Like, why is there no rubber in between that to dampen that? Because I know when I hit bumps, I feel that, and I hear it as well. So that's kind of just weird to me, but maybe I'll get some rubber on there just to try and dampen that noise. Maybe cut up a rubber hose, cut it in half, and then just slide it over it. Maybe put a zip tie on either side of it to hold it, but I guess we'll see. Maybe I'll do that in a future video for a mod. Alright, so these center stand bolts are torqued to 53 foot-pounds. First, we're going to go through and use our 3/8 ratchet and just get them somewhat tight, and then we'll go back through and torque them all to spec. I'm going to start with the front bolts on both sides, and then move to the rear bolts. That way it kind of centers itself. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, let's go to the other side quick. Alright, now I'm going to do the rear bolts. We'll just start over here. And we'll go to the other side now. Now that we have these 4 bolts tight, let's go ahead and go through and torque them to 53 foot-pounds. My torque wrench is set to 53 foot-pounds. Alright, do the back one. Alright, let's go to the other side and torque those down. Alright, now that these are torqued to spec, let's go ahead and move on to our kickstand bolt. Alright, now we can install our side stand bracket bolts, and these are torqued to 46 foot-pounds. I'm going to start by threading them in by hand and then come back through and torque them to spec. Alright, now that our bracket bolts are in, let's torque them to 46 foot-pounds. The torque wrench is set to 46 foot-pounds. Let's torque them down. Now that we have these torqued to spec, let's go ahead and put on our exhaust manifold header. Really quickly, before we put the exhaust manifold on, while it's out of the way, let's go ahead and put all of our coolant hose clamps on and tighten everything down. Now that we have all of our coolant hose clamps tightened, let's go ahead and put our exhaust manifold on. Alright, that's a good sign. I don't see any exhaust gaskets laying on the ground, so they all should be stuck in here. I'm going to finish off putting these nuts on here, then we'll move to the side and insert the bolts for the side brackets. So I'm only tightening these nuts hand tight, that way we have room for adjustments. Alright, let's move over to the side. Alright, now before we get too carried away, it's probably a good time for us to get our O2 sensor threaded into our exhaust, and then we can go ahead and get these side brackets mounted. So remember, we have to pre-wind our wire going back in because it's going to thread in and we never disconnected it. So pre-wind it a few times. Then we just need to snug it up with a 22mm. Now let's go ahead and get our side bolts mounted for this exhaust. There we go. So we were hitting on the oil pan on the back side with the bracket here, just barely. And I think it's because I had the exhaust manifold nuts a little bit too tight, so I loosened them up a bit and it gave me a little bit more room to work this around. So now we can go ahead and get our bolt placed inside this bracket. Let's move to the other side and get the other one placed in. Now that we have our rear bracket bolts in, let's go ahead and torque everything down, starting from the front to the rear. So let's go up to the header and get to our nuts. Alright, now these nuts for this exhaust manifold are torqued to 14 foot-pounds, and we're going to start from the middle and work our way out. We have our torque wrench set to 14 foot-pounds, and let's go ahead and torque these down. Now that those are all torqued to spec, let's go ahead and move to the back brackets. Alright, now these bolts are also torqued to 14 foot-pounds. Alright, let's move to the other side. And again, this one's 14 foot-pounds. Now that these are all torqued, let's go ahead and move on to our slip-on exhaust. Alright, I'm going to drop the center stand down just to give us a little bit more access to this slip-on portion. Now we can get our exhaust band situated and our nut and bolt through this bracket. Let's go ahead and move back down here, and we need to torque this bolt here to 14 foot-pounds. Now in order to get my torque wrench in here, I'm going to put this back up. So there is a stop on this exhaust manifold for this center stand. So it actually doesn't hit the suspension, but I guess it is hitting this, and I do feel that going down the road when I hit bumps. So I'm going to see if maybe there's a stopper or something that could go in here, because it looks like there's room for a stopper, but there just isn't one there. So maybe I can create something just to help dampen that noise right there. So, all right, let's go ahead and torque this on. Now we're going to torque this footrest bracket to 35 foot-pounds. All right, now that we have this torque to spec, there's one last thing I want to do in today's video. And the last thing I want to do is add a couple of quarts of oil to our oil pan and try and rotate this oil pump and see if I can't get it to prime a little bit of oil through the system. So let's go ahead and do that quick. But first, make sure your drain plug is tight. And they say to torque this to 31 foot-pounds. Seems awfully high, but yeah. Now I've already torqued mine to spec, and now I'm ready to go ahead and put oil in this. All right, I'm going to be adding the Mobil 1 4T racing oil. Full synthetic 10W40. I run this in all my racing bikes or sport bikes. So let's go ahead and pour some in. This system's about 3.8 or 4-quart system. I usually have to put about 4 quarts in after an oil change and replacing the filter. So I am going to replace the filter later on, but I do want to kind of run it a little bit so I can clear out any contaminants and then change the filter. So that won't be for a little bit later down the road. So I'm going to add 1 more quart of oil to this. That way we have 2 in the system, and hopefully that'll be enough to be able to circulate some oil through the system. Alright, now that we have a couple of quarts of oil in the system, let's see if we can't rotate this oil pump and get a little bit of oil pressure built up. Alright, to be honest, I can't really tell if we're building any oil pressure or not that way, so there is another way I'm going to do it when we get all the way back together. So I just tried that here to see if we could see or hear any difference, and I don't hear a squeak noise, so that's a plus. So I think that's going to do it for today's episode. If you liked what you've seen with this series so far, please help support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for future videos. Until next time, guys, thanks so much for watching. Peace.